Emily and Mark Wheeler had always been the envy of their friends and family. From the outside, their life appeared perfect, an immaculate home nestled in a peaceful neighborhood, two bright children who excelled in school, and a marriage that seemed strong and loving. Mark, a successful businessman, was the kind of husband who always appeared attentive in public, showering Emily with affection when their friends were around. He was the man everyone admired for his achievements and the family he had built. Emily, on the other hand, was the devoted wife, kind, nurturing, and graceful in everything she did. Together, they were the epitome of success. For years, Emily had been proud of the life they had created. She spent her days looking after the children, managing the household, and making sure Mark had everything he needed to succeed in his career. In return, Mark was generous with his time and resources, often taking Emily on romantic getaways or surprising her with thoughtful gifts. They were the perfect couple, and Emily believed that nothing could tear them apart. But as time went on, Emily began to notice subtle changes in Mark's behavior. He started staying late at work more often, sometimes coming home late at night, claiming he had to work on important projects. When they were together, Mark's attention seemed to wander, his mind elsewhere, and he would often become distracted by his phone, checking messages or emails even during dinner. The warmth he had once shown her began to fade, replaced by cold indifference. Emily began to feel the weight of the silence between them growing heavier with each passing day. Her suspicions only grew stronger when she noticed that Mark had begun to spend more time away from home, taking business trips that seemed to pop up out of nowhere. Emily tried to shake off the feelings of doubt, telling herself that it was just the stress of his job. But there was something about the way he avoided eye contact, the way he would change the subject when she asked questions, that made her uneasy. She began to find strange, unexplained items in their home, an expensive perfume that wasn't hers, a hotel receipt from a city she didn't recognize, and texts on Mark's phone with a name she didn't recognize. Emily's heart sank with the realization that something was terribly wrong. Her world was beginning to crack. The man she had trusted, the father of her children, the love of her life, was no longer the person she thought he was. The doubts gnawed at her, and she began to question whether their perfect marriage had ever been real at all. She couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was hiding something that would shatter everything she had believed in. As Emily's suspicions deepened, she found herself trapped in a whirlwind of confusion and anger. She didn't know who to turn to or how to confront Mark. She had always trusted him implicitly, but now she was faced with the unbearable truth that perhaps she hadn't known him at all. She spent sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, wondering where things had gone wrong and what she should do next. All the while, Mark continued to live his life as if everything were fine, unaware of the storm that was brewing inside Emily. In her heart, Emily knew that things could never go back to the way they were. The facade of their perfect marriage had been shattered, and the cracks were too deep to mend. But Emily was no longer the passive, devoted wife she once was. The pain of betrayal had sparked something inside her, a desire for control, for revenge, for a way out of the life that had become a prison. It was a dangerous path, but Emily was determined to take it. She could no longer ignore the truth that had been staring her in the face for so long. One evening, as Emily sat in the living room alone, her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. The weight of her suspicions about Mark had become unbearable, and the emotional distance between them felt suffocating. Mark, though physically present, was like a stranger to her, someone she didn't recognize anymore. She had tried to confront him several times, but each attempt ended in frustration and more lies. He had grown skilled at deflecting her questions, offering vague explanations or changing the subject altogether. The more Emily tried to pry into his secrets, the more Mark seemed to slip away, leaving her feeling powerless and defeated. The turning point came when Emily, in a moment of desperation, decided to search through Mark's personal belongings. She knew it was a breach of trust, but something inside her told her she had to know the truth. It was as though a shadow had descended over her life, and she couldn't rest until she uncovered what was hidden beneath it. With trembling hands, she went through his drawers, his desk, his briefcase, anything that might hold a clue. At first, she found nothing. Then, in a small compartment at the back of his office desk, she uncovered something that would change everything. It was a life insurance policy, one that Emily had never seen before. The policy was valued at $100,000, with her listed as the beneficiary. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she read through the document. On the surface, everything seemed ordinary. Mark had taken out the policy to provide for the family in the event of his death. But something about the timing of it felt off. She couldn't remember him ever discussing such a policy with her, nor had they ever talked about life insurance in any serious way. Mark had always handled the family finances, but this felt different. As Emily continued to read, a chilling thought began to form in her mind. The policy was recent, only a few months old, and there was something unsettling about the amount. $100,000 was a substantial sum, but it wasn't life-changing. It was enough to make Emily question why Mark had felt the need to get it. The more she thought about it, the more the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. The late nights, the mysterious absences, the unexplained behavior, all of it began to make sense in the context of this insurance policy. Could it be that Mark was planning something? Could he be trying to get rid of her? A sense of dread washed over Emily, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, calculated realization. She had been living in a marriage built on lies and deceit, but this was the final straw. If Mark was planning something sinister, if he had no intention of being faithful to her, then she couldn't afford to wait around and let him destroy her and their children. Emily's mind raced with possibilities. What if she could turn the tables? What if she could get rid of him before he had the chance to hurt her? The idea grew in her mind, taking root like a poison. She didn't want to hurt Mark, not at first, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had been pushed to the brink. The anger, the betrayal, the years of emotional neglect, all of it had built up inside her, and now it felt like the only way out was to get rid of the source of her pain. Emily was no longer the woman who had once believed in love and loyalty. She had been transformed by the lies and manipulation, and now she was determined to take control of her life, no matter the cost. With the insurance policy in hand, Emily began to plan. She researched the different ways to poison someone without being detected, knowing that the slow-acting toxins would give her enough time to carry out her plan. She knew she had to be patient and precise. Anything less would raise suspicion. Her first step was to gather the ingredients. She carefully selected the poison that would leave no trace, a substance that would make Mark feel unwell but wouldn't immediately arouse suspicion. It was a calculated decision, one that would give her the time she needed to get the insurance payout and start a new life. The more Emily thought about it, the more certain she became. Mark had betrayed her, and now it was time for her to make sure that she would never have to live in his shadow again. She couldn't trust him anymore, and she couldn't let him control her any longer. If she had to get rid of him to secure her future, then that was exactly what she would do. The plan was set in motion, and there was no turning back. The woman who had once been a devoted wife and mother had now become someone entirely different, someone capable of anything to achieve her goal. Emily spent the following days carefully planning the dinner she knew would set everything in motion. She had thought about it endlessly, trying to make sure every detail was perfect. Mark, who had been distant for weeks, would be coming home late again after a long day at work, and Emily knew this would be the perfect opportunity to execute her plan. It was strange, almost unsettling. How calm she felt as she prepared. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal had all coalesced into something far more dangerous and intense, cold determination. She decided to cook Mark's favorite meal, something he would never suspect would be the last dinner of his life. The meal would need to be comforting and familiar, a small but effective way of luring him into a false sense of normalcy. It was the perfect disguise for what was about to happen. Emily took extra care with the preparation, adding a touch of her usual perfectionism to make sure nothing seemed out of place. She even set the table in their favorite spot, the one by the window, where they used to have their intimate dinners before everything began to unravel. As she went through the motions of cooking, Emily felt an eerie sense of control over the situation. She had never felt so clear-headed, so focused. The house was quiet, the children were staying with her mother for the weekend, and everything was in place. There was no turning back now. She had already made up her mind this was the only way to reclaim her life, to break free from the lies and the emotional suffocation that had plagued her for so long. When Mark finally arrived home, he didn't seem to notice anything unusual. He greeted Emily with a tired smile, the same routine he had always followed. He gave her a brief kiss on the cheek before heading to the bathroom to wash up. Emily pretended to be happy, to be the wife he had once known, but inside she was cold. Every smile, every word felt like a mask. She wanted him to feel safe, to feel like everything was normal so he wouldn't question a thing. She served him the meal, watching him closely as he took the first bite. Mark complimented her cooking as he always did, savoring the food like it was just another evening in their life. Emily sat across from him, forcing herself to eat a few bites as well. She couldn't let him see the anxiety that was building inside her. She had to be calm, composed. He had to trust that everything was fine, that nothing had changed. In the pit of her stomach, a sickening thrill pulsed through her. The poison was there, waiting to do its work, and she knew it would soon begin to take effect. As they continued the meal, Mark began to feel a slight discomfort. At first it was nothing major, a slight queasiness, a vague feeling of tiredness. But Emily had anticipated this. She had calculated the dosage perfectly. The poison wouldn't cause instant death. It was subtle, working its way into his system slowly, just enough to make him feel sick without being obvious. It wasn't an immediate crisis, and that was what made it the perfect plan. The more time passed, the more Emily could control the situation, making sure that by the time Mark realized something was wrong, it would be too late. Mark's movements became sluggish. His energy seemed to drain away as the hours went by. He started to complain of a mild headache, followed by nausea, but he attributed it to exhaustion from the day. Emily, ever the devoted wife, offered to make him tea, pretending to be concerned. Inside, she could barely contain the sense of triumph that was bubbling up. The plan was working. He was falling right into it. The minutes stretched on and the house grew quiet once again, except for the faint sound of Mark's labored breathing. Emily stood in the kitchen waiting. She had done everything right, and now she just had to wait for the inevitable. The poison would work. Mark's health would decline, and soon enough the insurance payout would be hers. There was no turning back, and no second guessing. This was the price of betrayal, and Emily was willing to pay it. The hours passed in a tense silence. Mark's condition deteriorated rapidly. He had been lying on the couch, groaning occasionally, his face twisted in discomfort. His earlier complaints of a headache had now turned into full-blown nausea, and his body trembled from the feverish sweats that had overtaken him. Emily stayed close by, watching him with a practiced calmness. Her heart beat steadily, almost too steadily, as she kept a close eye on him. She had expected this. She had known that the poison would take time to show its full effects, but it was still unsettling to watch him suffer. Mark was now too weak to get up. His speech was slurred, and he seemed disoriented, as if the world around him was spinning out of control. He kept asking Emily for water, but each time she brought him a glass, he could barely keep it down. His stomach was in knots, and he seemed to be growing weaker by the minute. Yet, Emily remained composed, offering him gentle reassurances, trying to comfort him as if she hadn't just been the architect of his suffering. Her thoughts, though, were far from comforting. In her mind, she was already planning what would come next. This would be over soon, and she could move on with her life. Despite everything, part of Emily felt a pang of guilt, but it was fleeting. The overwhelming sense of justice she had clung to for so long drowned out any trace of remorse. Mark had wronged her in ways that went beyond his infidelity. He had made her feel small, irrelevant, and unimportant. She had given him everything: her love, her loyalty, her trust, and he had thrown it all away for the thrill of an affair. What had once been a deep connection between them had withered into something toxic and painful, and now Emily was taking matters into her own hands. As the hours stretched on, Emily could feel the weight of the situation settling in. She had always thought she would have more time. She had envisioned a slow decline, a few days of sickness that would eventually lead to his death, allowing her the perfect alibi. But Mark's condition was deteriorating faster than she had anticipated. His skin had taken on a sickly pallor, and his breathing had become shallow, ragged. Emily could see that he was slipping further and further away from consciousness, and she realized that the end might come sooner than she had planned. She hadn't expected him to be so vulnerable, so fragile. Part of her wondered if he would even survive the night. The thought crossed her mind, a thought she hadn't allowed herself to entertain until now. What if he survived? What if the poison didn't kill him? Or worse, what if someone discovered it was poisoning? She shook the thought away. That was a risk she had already factored in. She had been careful, too careful. The poison was designed to be untraceable, and by the time anyone figured it out, it would be too late. Mark would be gone, and she would have the insurance payout. She had calculated every possible angle. This was her escape, her liberation from a life she no longer wanted. But as the minutes passed, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creep into her thoughts. Mark's breaths were becoming more erratic, his eyes fluttering as if he were trying to fight the darkness creeping in around him. She knew she had to act quickly. She couldn't afford to have anyone suspect that something was amiss. If the doctors were to find out that Mark had been poisoned, the investigation would begin, and the carefully constructed web of lies would start to unravel. In the back of her mind, Emily could hear the echo of her own thoughts, reminding her that she had come too far to back out now. She had already made her decision, and there was no going back. Mark's suffering was nearly over, and soon everything would be hers. She just had to hold on for a little longer. The clock on the wall ticked louder than ever, marking the slow march toward the end. Emily stood by, watching, waiting, knowing that the life she had once known was slipping away along with Mark's final breaths. By the time the early morning light began to filter through the curtains, Mark had slipped into unconsciousness. His breathing was shallow, and his pulse weak, barely perceptible beneath his skin. Emily stood over him, her face a mask of cold resolve, while her mind raced through the aftermath of the night's events. The poison had worked faster than she had anticipated, but in the end, it had been exactly as she had planned. Mark was slipping away, and soon he would be gone. Her heart, once heavy with the weight of betrayal, now felt strangely empty, as if the anger and pain that had driven her to this point had been replaced by something else, an unfamiliar void. For a moment, Emily considered calling an ambulance. She knew that if she acted now, if she called for help, there was a chance Mark could survive. The doctors could pump his stomach, administer treatment, and possibly save him. But she quickly dismissed the thought. That was not the plan. She had come too far to risk everything now. Her future was already set, the path ahead already clear. There was no room for doubt, no room for second-guessing. The deed was done. She went to the kitchen to prepare herself for the next steps. Her hands were steady as she washed her face, taking a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. It was done. She was about to take control of her life again. She had never imagined that it would come to this, that she would go to such lengths to escape a marriage that had once been full of promise. But now, with Mark's impending death, she could see the horizon opening up, offering her a new life, a fresh start. She knew she had to act quickly. She needed to make sure that everything seemed normal when the authorities arrived. Emily had already considered the possibility that someone might find out about the poison, and she had taken precautions. She made sure to clean up any traces of the toxin, hiding any remnants that could tie her to the crime. She even made sure to discard the bottles and packaging, erasing all evidence of the poison she had used. She wasn't going to leave any room for suspicion, Mark's death would look like an unfortunate, mysterious illness that had struck him out of nowhere, a sudden and tragic event that no one could have predicted. By the time the first light of day crept into the room, Mark had stopped breathing. His body was cold, lifeless, and the faint hint of a smile seemed to linger on his lips, as though he had found peace in his final moments. Emily stared at him for a moment, feeling nothing but emptiness. She had expected more, maybe a sense of satisfaction, maybe some kind of emotional release. But instead she was left with a gnawing silence, the sound of her own breath in the stillness of the room. Her thoughts turned to the insurance payout. $100,000, it seemed like so much, but now that it was within her reach, it felt almost insignificant in comparison to what she had lost. Mark's life had been so much more than money. The family they had built, the years they had spent together, all of it was now reduced to a cruel, final transaction. She had taken everything from him, and yet there was no real victory in it. She would never get back the years that had been stolen from her, the trust that had been shattered beyond repair. Mark's death would not undo the damage that had been done, but it would give her the freedom she had longed for, the chance to rebuild her life, to make her own choices without the shadow of Mark hanging over her. It was a small consolation for all the hurt she had endured, but it was enough. The payout would allow her to start over, to move on from the past and create a future on her own terms. No more lies, no more betrayal. Emily knew that there would be consequences, that the investigation would eventually uncover the truth. But by then, it would be too late. Mark would be gone, and the insurance money would be hers. She had already planned her next step. She would leave the town, change her name, start fresh. No one would ever know the truth. As the authorities arrived later that day, Emily put on her best performance. She was the grieving widow, distraught by the sudden loss of her husband. She cried on cue, shaking with sorrow, giving the impression of a woman who had been blindsided by tragedy. No one suspected a thing. The perfect facade. And as she stood there, watching them carry Mark's body away, Emily knew that her life was about to change. The past was behind her, and the future stretched out ahead, full of possibilities, free from the man who had betrayed her, free from the suffocating grip of a marriage that had long since died. She had won, or at least, that's what she told herself. She had secured her freedom, and now there was nothing left to stand in her way.